United States, it is almost Mother's Day, and so here on HGTV Handmade, we're going to be sharing some ideas for DIY gifts that you can make for mom, or for any maternal figure in your life. So a really common gift that you can give your mother is a framed family photo, but if you already used that idea for Christmas, today I have a slight twist on that idea, and that is a picture of your childhood home, but we're going to do an illustration out of cut paper to get a really beautiful handmade piece of art. This is a lot easier than you might think, so let me show you how to do it. So first you're going to pick the photo that you'll be working off of. Now this is not actually my childhood home. I didn't want to do an actual picture of my house for, privacy reasons and the internet and all that. So I was looking through HGTV magazine and I found this image of this adorable little purple house. So I'm going to use that instead. But the idea here is that if it's a gift for your mom, you could make it a house that you guys have lived in. So when you're deciding on the photo to use as a reference, you're going to want your photo to be pretty much straight on to the house so that you can basically just trace it. But if it's at a slight angle, like mine is, that's fine. So scan the photo if it's a printed photo and bring it into your photo editing program of choice. For this project, I prefer Adobe Illustrator, but you could also do it in Photoshop or InDesign or any program that has a pen tool and a layers palette. So you're just going to go ahead and create a simple illustration of the house on top of the photo. Now, I'm not going to share the entire process of me doing this because it took a little while and that would be kind of boring for you, but I'm going to share a few things that I learned along the way. Number one, use the Pathfinder tool to mimic how you'll be cutting out the paper later on. For something like this window pane, I knew that I wanted it all to be all one piece and to go over the black interior of the window. So I drew the rectangles and then used the Unite tool in the Pathfinder palette to make them all one shape. And then you can also use your layers palette to mimic how you'll be stacking the paper. I know that this black shape will go under the window pane, so I drew it slightly bigger than it had to be, so that when I cut it out I have some leeway and it doesn't have to fit completely perfectly into this other shape that I'm cutting out. Number two, if you're working with a pretty symmetrical house, just draw half the house first and then duplicate it and flip it. This way you're only doing half the work and you can go in at the end and add doorknobs or anything else that only goes on one side. And third, try to keep a limited color palette. Figure out what kind of scrapbook paper or other paper you might have around your house to work with, and keep that in mind as you're working on your illustration. However, if you only need a tiny bit of a certain color, you can always print that out from a color printer and then cut your shape out of that. If you don't have an entire sheet of scrapbook paper, that's the exact color that you need. And four, don't worry about your illustration being perfect. For example, I moved these bottom windows outward a bit so that there was more room next to the door, and I exaggerated some of the architectural features of the windows. Just try to kind of keep the gist of the house without it getting too overly detailed. And then finally, if you have some pieces that are the same color but need to be stacked on top of each other, give them a slight stroke in your illustration so you can differentiate from them on the computer. And just remember to remove it when you put together your file for printing. Speaking of which, once your illustration is finished, it's time to take it apart into pieces to make all of your patterns. So this is what my page ended up looking like, but you may have more or less pieces depending on what house you're illustrating. So go ahead and print it out, and I actually decided to print mine out in black and white on my laser printer. And I printed them on cardstock, not on computer paper, because I wanted the pieces to be a little bit thicker so they really hold their weight on the illustration. So now you can gather your scrapbook paper in all of the colors that you're going to need, and then one color at a time, carefully cut out the pattern, and then with a really sharp pencil, flip it over and trace it onto your scrapbook paper, and then cut it out with an X-Acto knife, and once again, take your time and be really careful. If you want to, you can now draw on a texture. For example, on all of the purple pieces, I drew on stripes because the house has siding on it, but if you pick scrapbook paper that already has a texture, you can of course skip this step. So I also printed out an image of the finished illustration at the same size, and to keep all of my pieces straight, I'm kind of stacking them on the illustration as I go. So once I had all of the big main pieces cut out, I then moved on to all of the white pieces. And for these, since all of them were symmetrical, mostly just a lot of rectangles, I could just cut them out from my printout, flip them over, and then I have a white shape. And then the same with all of the black shapes. Since I printed in black, I just had to cut them out from the printout. And then I was good to go. And then after that, there ended up only being a couple shapes left that I had to trace onto colored paper and cut out, and so I just finished all of those. So once again, a couple tips. If you have any interior shapes that need to be cut out, always cut the interior shapes out first, and then you can move on and do the full exterior shape. Start this project with a new X-Acto knife blade, and then make sure you have extras nearby, just in case you need to replace it, especially for the really small, detailed shapes. And once again, I know this is kind of a theme for this video, but take your time and be careful. So once you have everything cut out, it's time to start gluing it together so your house doesn't look like it went through an earthquake. I'm going to be using glue dots for the largest pieces because they make it look a little more 3D than just flat glue. But you could use craft glue, a glue stick, rubber cement, whatever you have. And then I'm also going to be using a glue stick for the really small pieces because it's less messy to work with than any kind of liquid glue. So take the paper that you're going to be using as your backdrop. I'm going to be using a piece of watercolor paper because I like how textured it is, and then cut it down to the size of your frame. And then measure out the center of the paper and use glue dots to attach your first shapes. And then just continue gluing everything down, taking your time and referring back to your printed out illustration so that you can make sure all of the slightly different sized rectangles and all the other pieces are going in the right place. Once you're done gluing, let the glue dry for a couple hours and then just go ahead and frame it, and now you have a beautiful gift that I'm sure your mom will love. So a few things. I purposefully picked a very colorful house, but if your house is not bright purple, you can always bring in a little more color by making the background a nice pastel color, or you can take some liberties with flowers and trees and decorations surrounding the house. And then you can also, of course, leave the glass in the frame if you want to. I just decided not to because I was getting some weird reflections with filming, but obviously that's not a concern for you guys, so just do whichever way you think looks best. So if you want to try out this craft, but you're not necessarily confident in your own illustration abilities, I'm going to put the patterns for this house down in the description so you can recreate my version. So you can go ahead and download those as a PDF, but of course you can do this with any other house that you want, and if you decide to make a different version, I'd love to see a picture, so please send one to me on Twitter or Tumblr or Instagram. So I hope you guys liked this fun Mother's Day DIY project. Let me know what you're getting your mom for Mother's Day, or what you already got her if you live in a country that already celebrated Mother's Day. And if you do want to give your mom a framed photo of yourself or of your family, I actually posted a video on my own channel last year with Mary Doodles about how to dress up a framed photo in a couple fun ways. So I'm going to link that on the end screen here, and you can go ahead and click on it if you want to see another Mother's Day present idea. So thank you guys so much for watching HGTV Handmade, and I will see you all again next week. Bye everyone!